Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how you doing? Well, this video that I'm doing for you is like a Thanksgiving special type thing, okay? And I know that a lot of us like to do some homemade stuff, okay? And a lot of times when we want to go and do the homemade stuff, we can't, right? Because, well, we don't have this ingredient or that ingredient or whatever the case may be. And the one ingredient that a lot of us may be missing is yeast. Okay. You remember the great yeast shortage of 2020? I remember that oh so well. I remember the great yeast shortage with millions of people at home and the food shortages of all kinds, and people who had never thought about baking bread before suddenly became frenzied with the desire. You know what I mean? So it didn't take long before stores were sold out of yeast and people turned to the internet, of course, right? And it was the top search literally on Google was, how do you make yeast? So since then, I've done quite a bit of experimenting because you guys know that I have a bread maker and stuff like that, right? And I've done experimenting with yeast and bread baking. And now that winter is here and the holidays are here, it's prime time for homemade bread with soup or chili or whatever. And I wanted to pass this info along. Okay. Now, the first thing, incredibly, I actually found you're going to die when you hear this. I actually found yeast that I purchased like years ago because we were doing, Sean was in the pantry for some reason and he's like, what is this? And it was, what the heck is the brand? It's the block yeast. And I'm like, I was looking for that. And he's just like, what is that? And I was like, it's yeast. And he's just like, I thought yeast comes in those packets, you know, the stuff that my mom puts in the toilet. I'm like, yeah, you could use that too, you know. But anyway, I bought it like years ago because before I bought a bread maker, I used to make bread from scratch with my hands and put it in the oven, okay? And it was still effective. And when, you know, and I took it out and I mean, I couldn't believe when we, you know, because you have to prove it. You not literally prove that it's yeast, but you have to prove yeast. Okay. And within minutes, you know, you see like this very old yeast and you can actually prove it and it's still good. Okay. So lesson learned, never throw out yeast before you actually prove it. Okay. Now, occasionally, there are people who have had success with older yeast, okay? But bottom line is that store-bought yeast is for short term, okay? If you have store-bought yeast stored longer than above mentioned, like, you know, time frames, okay, like 6 months, maybe a year in the freezer type thing, airtight containers, you know what I'm saying? Follow this simple test to see if it's still active, okay? A container of yeast that isn't active anymore should be thrown out, okay? Because your bread is going to go seriously, okay? So follow these instructions, write them down, okay? Get out your prepper notebook and write them down. Dissolve 1 teaspoon of sugar in a half cup of warm water from the tap. Between 110, 115 degrees is most effective, okay? Do you have a little thermometer, like a meat thermometer? Use that, okay? The only way to really be sure about the temperature, like I said, is to use like a meat thermometer, okay? Now, when in doubt, the water from your faucet should be warm but not hot to the touch, okay? Stir in your dry yeast. Either one like quarter-ounce packet or 2 quarter-ounce quarter teaspoons of granulated yeast. Okay, now most people say that the yeast should be brought to room temperature first, but there's always that but I have always had good luck when using it straight from the freezer. But that's just me. I mean, you know, you might have better luck using it this way. I have better luck using it that way. Whatever. But listen, it only takes about 3 to 4 minutes for the yeast to wake up and start to rise. So after about 10 minutes, the surface of your yeast water mixture will look foamy. Okay. And if so, then congrats. It's a baby boy. Okay. You have active yeast. So it should be used immediately. Literally. Immediately. Okay. And most recipes take into account the liquid needing to proof yeast and stuff. And if yours does not, and I mean does not, deduct half cup of liquid from your recipe if you proof the yeast with this method. Okay. So a good way to tell if your yeast has risen significantly or sufficiently is to use a 1 cup measuring cup. Okay. If the yeast foam rises to the top, you're good to go. If your yeast has an insufficient rise, it's not good anymore. It's not good to use for baking. Okay. Just throw it out. You know, put it to rest, put it to bed. It's not good. So now, the second thing, you can make yeast easily. Just saying. But it's somewhat unpredictable. Okay. And not always successful. I've tried the process with the raisins, the apples, the potatoes. I've done it all. Sometimes ended up with a yeast starter, sometimes just a jar of stank water. Okay. Now, following the instructions, have at it. Just listen. I've theorized. If room temperature might affect the success of this process, place the jar outside, put it in the microwave, put it in the closet, whatever, where it's warm. Lesson learned. If you want to make your own yeast, you may have to do a lot of testing. If you cannot get to the grocery store for Fleischmann's, what's the alternative? Try growing your own yeast, right? I have a few methods that should fit most needs and skill levels, depending on the availability of the items that I have listed that I wrote down. You know, trial and error type thing. Just choose the one that fits for you, that's in your region, your personal stockpile. All right? Write these ingredients down. A clean jar, mason jar, whatever. 24 ounces or larger, okay? Sterilize in hot water, allow it to dry. Now you're going to need water. Clean, filtered, or bottled water is best. Tap water can be used depending on your local conditions. Now, here's a warning to you though. Too much chlorine in your water or water that is too basic can kill the yeast. Now, raisins or other fruit, most fruits, they have traces of yeast on their skins. That's the thing. So note that when you may not get as good of a result with fruit that has been washed and waxed, So here's the instructions. Place 3 to 4 tablespoons of raisins in your jar. Adding a few tablespoons of honey, sugar, it will facilitate the fermentation process. Now fill the jar 3/4 full of water. Place the lid on the jar tightly, but lightly. Hand tightened. you know what I mean. Do not tighten the lid. Don't do that, okay? Because you want to allow some air to escape naturally. You know what I'm saying? Place the jar at a constant room temperature. Do not allow the jar to get cold. Don't do it. This will kill off the yeast, and then it stops the process, and then you're going to be pissy because then you're going to have to start all over again. Okay? So, stir at least once a day, 3 to 4 days. When bubbles start to form on the top and you smell a wine-like fermentation, then you have yeast. Okay? The raisins or the fruit should be floating. Place your new yeast in the fridge. Yeast is already present on the grain. So all you need to do is cultivate it in a manner similar to what I was just talking about before. Okay, so here's a basic recipe for like a sourdough starter for you, okay? Here's the ingredients. Write this down. Okay, so 1 1/4 cup of unbleached AP flour or milled wheat berry. 1 cup clean warm water. 1 sterile jar with cheesecloth or lid. Here's the instructions. Mix the flour in the warm water and keep it at room temperature. After a couple of days, the mixture is going to start to bubble and it will start to rise too. And keep your starter in the fridge when it's not in use, okay? And use as you would like any sourdough starter, all right? Now, when it comes to starting yeast from potatoes, the starch in potatoes makes it another prime candidate for yeast production. So what you're going to need is 1 unpeeled medium-sized potato, 4 cups of warm water, 1 teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of sugar, and 1 quart jar, like your Masons, you know. Now, rinse your potato to remove the dirt, but don't scrub it too much. Cut it into pieces to facilitate cooking. Then boil it until cooked through. Drain it, save the water. Mash the potato, add sugar and salt. Now, allow the mixture to cool until it's room temperature, okay? Add the water to the mashed potato until the whole mixture equals 1 quart, okay? Now, cover it, let it sit in a warm place, and allow it to ferment for a couple of days, all right? Now, let's talk about feeding the starter, okay? Once you have created your own yeast, you need to feed it regularly. This means adding 1 cup flour, 1 cup water to the mix so that the yeast can keep growing, okay? You will need to feed the starter daily if it's at room temperature, or weekly if it's in the fridge, all right? Now, if you don't bake bread that day, you will also need to toss out 1 cup of the starter after feeding it so the ratios stay the same. This is an important step, and it can be a great motivator to bake regularly so that none of your hard work goes to waste. Yeast starters are one thing you will not want to throw into your compost pile. I will say that, okay? Because the bacteria can grow out of control and it'll give you a very unpleasant result. Now, one community member had asked me, if I only had a small amount of yeast left, could I just use that yeast powder for a DIY yeast starter? All right, well, we did just that in the beginning with providing an amount of yeast, and then just use that as a starter by adding a small amount of flour each day, okay? This is a great way to maximize the small amount of yeast that you have on hand and theoretically never run out of yeast. I like that this method was so easy and instantly successful when compared to the various DIYs processing, like using potatoes, etc. Okay. Now, these yeast starters will give you a loaf of sourdough or sour-ish dough breads to put the DIY yeast to work, or with whatever process you use, okay? You'll need a sourdough bread recipe. Start there. Start with your recipe that you already have. Now, I know it's not like a beautiful loaf of sandwich bread, that many prefer. But once you start using the starter and become familiar with the results that you do get, you can branch out with different bread recipes, okay? So just be warned that they will all be experiments, okay? It's not all going to be the same every single time. You know what I'm saying? And it's not until you get it right, you know what I mean? Because it's going to be an experiment every single time. And until you get it just right, those results will be just that. It'll be experiments. It's not going to be pretty, okay? Like, take a look at this picture, and you're going to be like, "Ay," you know what I mean? So, as with any, practical skills, making your own yeast successfully and then using it in a loaf of bread will take a lot of practice. Fortunately, in most all cases, I would guess, at least the finished loaf will be delicious, if not beautiful, So, my friends, my family, my community, okay? On this chilly November day, this holiday season, think about making a nice loaf of bread. Be sure to have some butter, never margarine, and maybe even a hot jar of honey, okay? And enjoy. Because this is a way of expanding your horizons when it comes to prepping. And there may become a time when we won't be able to get our hands on yeast anymore. And I hope you'll be able to look back on this video, and if you wrote everything down in your prepper notebook, you'll be able to say, I learned that from her. Okay? All right, guys, I'm out of here. I'll see you in the next one. You stay safe. You stay positive. You keep prepping. And as always, fear less. Ciao.